Local authorities must provide free information and advice to any person on preventing and relieving homelessness. The Act goes on to specify the type and the quality of advice. We know that it now must include preventing homelessness, securing accommodation when homeless, the rights of homeless people or those threatened with homelessness, the help that is available, by whom and how to access that help. But it does then go on to look at tailoring it to meet the needs of specified groups. And those groups we're all quite familiar with, really. So we're talking about ensuring that our service is designed to meet the needs of specific groups. Care leavers, people released from prison, former members of the regular armed forces, victims of domestic abuse, people leaving hospital, people suffering mental illness, and our personal favourite, any other group. So, you know, and again, just as a bit of a reminder here, you've all written homelessness strategies, you've all reviewed the services that are available within your district. So you've put out there at a strategic level what those groups are that you have, those other groups that you recognise you need to be providing that additional support to. You've already said who's providing the advice and support within your district. So you just now need to make sure in your general advice that's offered by your officers that they're actually now talking about that as part of that process, because the Act is now that specific.
So just thinking about the assessment, because the assessment actually links into the reporting that we have to do through the HCLIC. How many of you have looked at the HCLIC schema? Okay, so a good number. If you haven't had a look at the HCLIC schema, please do, because it's a lot of data that we have to return, and the data that we have to return will need to inform our assessments. So if you're not actually marrying up your assessment with the HCLIC, you're not going to be returning the level of data that you need to. So just a plea really to do have a look at the HCLIC. Version 1.4 we're on now, the final 1.4.
As is the final 1 and 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3. 1.4 last week, was it last week? Last week 1.4 came out.
So just in terms of the assessment, we know that if the local authority is satisfied that the applicant is homeless or threatened with homelessness and eligible, then an assessment has to be carried out. The Code of Guidance says that in most circumstances, the assessment will require at least one face-to-face appointment. So there are local authorities who are running their services predominantly by telephone at the moment. The code says the expectation is that we will do at least one face-to-face, and that the wizard-like tools, so some of the IT systems that might be running at the moment that give customers advice, wizard-like tools will not replace the assessment function. So that's not to say that there isn't a role for wizards, but that is really more in terms of a signposting and initial provision of advice. It's not going to be able to do your assessment for you. So the assessment is specified at section 189A of the Act, and the Act actually says what we need to cover in the assessment, that being the circumstances causing homelessness, the housing needs of the applicant and any members of their household, the type of accommodation that the household require, and really importantly, any support that the household will need to secure and retain accommodation. For those of you who have pored over the HCLIC, you'll see that the Ministry are asking us to record not only the support needs at presentation, but what support we're putting in place to meet those needs and whether our customer engages with them. Okay, so there's a lot of information that we need to record, and if we're not recording it in the assessment, then we're not going to be able to return the data. The Act requires that we notify the applicant of the outcome of the assessment in writing. So you need to be thinking about what that's going to look like for you. Some local authorities are thinking pen and paper, even carbon paper has been mentioned at some events. Others are looking at using their IT provision. And if you don't have IT provision in place, you do only have 46 days, working days to sort that out. So you need to be asking yourself, what happens if I don't have that in place in the next 46 days?
Can I just ask on that last slide, that most circumstances assessments will require at least one face-to-face interview. So in that slide, is that taken from the new code?
It's the code, yes, the draft code.
Yeah, the face-to-face interview is from the code, and the wizard-like tools cannot replace the assessment function, was what Joe Beck said at one of the earlier meetings late last year. So.
So with the assessment, there is a place for standard forms and checklists to record information. But again, just really thinking about if you've got a set of forms that you're working on, you need to make sure that they marry up with your H-click. So there's that sort of intrinsic link all the way through the process. You also need to make sure that your staff are making really clear contemporaneous notes. So those ongoing notes that officers, it's so important that they record. Sean often says, actually, if it isn't written down, then it didn't happen. I was expecting a chorus there, Sean. That's right, there we go. Round of applause, Sean. And what we often see with local authorities is that they do hours and hours and hours and hours of prevention work. And there's one note on a case file or 2 notes, and it just doesn't demonstrate the hard work that the officer has put in. And we know that there are more rights to review under the HRA, making sure that we keep good quality contemporaneous notes will help us firstly to make review decisions on those cases and hopefully help to limit some of the review requests that we're getting. Put yourself in the position of a customer. If you are the customer, can you understand why the decision that has been made has been made? Is it a reasoned decision letter, or does it just set out the legislation and say that it doesn't apply to the customer in that case?
So again, just a bit of a reminder really, when you're going back to base, have a look to see whether you've actually put this in place or not. Most case assessments will require at least one face-to-face interview. Our trailblazers are telling us that they're taking between an hour and a half and 2 hours to complete a full assessment. We're talking about all cases, priority need and non-priority need. Trailblazers are saying that gets quicker as officers become better at providing those interviews where they're looking at assessment and investigation. We also need to think about office space, and I think this was mentioned this morning as well. Ultimately, if we're saying that the interviews are going to take longer, in some authorities, we are going to be doing more interviews because you may not be providing that service at the moment to non-priority need households. So if you're struggling now for interview rooms, you need to think about how you're going to manage this moving forward and whether you've got additional resources that you can tap into, whether that's your local libraries or your local RP or some of your other offices. But just think about how you're going to ensure that you've got sufficient interview room space. You should also consider and record the applicant's wishes and preferences, whether they are or not able to meet them, but you need to also ensure that you're managing expectations. So it's a much more rounded interview that we're looking at here. We're looking at trying to understand why the customers come into us, how we can empower the customer to take some control over this, and what sort of outcomes that we're going to be agreeing together for individual applicants. An effective practice to summarise the assessment and ensure it's accurate. So again, we want everybody to leave the interview with one version of the truth. So if your officers are repeating back what they believe has been said through the interview and what's been agreed, you should at least then find that when you're looking at getting the applicant to agree these steps within the plan, there's no surprises. They absolutely know what's coming.